Alright, so this was in the news recently. The president decided to go on social media and complain that an ad in Canada used audio from a speech where Ronald Reagan talks about tariffs, and he's saying it was false, something. The fuck did that little dude say? He said, Ronald Reagan Foundation has just announced that Canada has fraudulently used an advertisement, which is, written in all caps, fake, featuring Ronald Reagan speaking negatively about tariffs. The ad was for $75 million. They only did this to interfere with the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts. And this part's in all caps too. Tariffs are very important to the national security and economy of the USA. And this is written in normal caps. Based on their egregious behavior, then all caps again, he wrote, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. And then in normal capitalization, thank you for your attention on this matter, President Donald J. Trump. Donald DJT. And he did have an exclamation point at one point in there. So a little bit of fact checking. Apparently the government of Canada actually did spend $75 million on that ad. And while they are pulling the ad over the president's remarks, and yeah, the Ronald Reagan Foundation seems to be complaining too, because it is taken out of context. When I went and actually watched the full 5-minute speech regarding tariffs that this is pulled from, the full speech in its context actually has more negative things to say about tariffs than what's in the commercial. And the closest thing in that speech to him not really saying what he's made out to have said is that he chose to make an exception to the conventional wisdom of not passing tariffs with regards to the semiconductors that were being imported from Japan, on the grounds that at the time, or at least this is what Japan was being accused of at the time, is that they were keeping the prices of semiconductors below the actual costs so that they could, what they would call dumping illegally, creating unfair disadvantages for American semiconductor makers. Because theirs were so much cheaper by comparison by doing this, and a lot of American manufacturers were claiming that they were being restricted from entering markets in Japan. And there was a trade agreement that we had signed with Japan in 1986 that they claimed Japan was violating by using some of these practices. This is the reason why Reagan passed a tariff on Japan in the 80s, and this speech is basically him saying that this specific situation with Japan counted as an exception to where it was necessary to pass tariffs. But most of the speech is him saying that we shouldn't use tariffs and that it's better to foster free trade without tariffs. Also, on what planet does the Supreme Court make decisions based on what they saw in a commercial? That doesn't make any sense. However, if you pay close attention to the video of him giving this speech, you'll notice that he's actually reading from a script. So the argument could be made that these were not actually his opinions, but realistically speaking, he was probably reading a script because he had a PR guy write it for him, so that it would be like clear on the message. Like, it would be one thing if Ronald Reagan was still active in politics, but he's not even really alive anymore. And if I'm being honest, I think the real reason Canada aired this ad using Ronald Reagan's speech was because for so many years he had been the symbol of the ideology of conservatives, I guess, is the best way I can describe it. And many of the people who support these tariffs seem to be conservatives. So many of which say that Ronald Reagan was the best president we've ever had in history, many of which even say that he had the best economic policies of any president in the country. The Laffer curve started becoming popularized during the Reagan administration. That's considered to be a more practical view on tax policy. So I can see where Trump sees it as a big slap in the face for him and his tariffs to hear or to see a commercial suggesting Reagan wouldn't have supported him in this. The big issue for me isn't whether or not the commercial's true. It's not even really whether or not the president's telling the truth. I mean, let's look at the track record on presidents, really. None of them were telling the truth. And Trump's no different. The big issue, at least this is what I'm gathering from it, is that he's using tariffs and his bargaining position in regards to them to suppress free speech. I mean, granted, it's in Canada. They don't really have free speech anyways, but I mean, Y'all like that slippery slope argument so much. I mean, where do you think this is going? Just saying. Having said that, I expect everybody who watches this video to just immediately take me on my word for this with no questions whatsoever, because as we all know, I'm some guy on the internet talking, and that makes me the ultimate authority in the world. Man, wouldn't that be ridiculous if I actually meant that seriously? Or is it more ridiculous that there actually are people who believe... Never mind. So in other words, I decided to just give you a side-by-side comparison of the ad and Reagan's speech next to each other so that you can watch them yourselves and draw your own conclusion. Did the Canadian government really misquote Ronald Reagan? Is Trump using his bargaining position to bully other countries? Let me know what you think in the comment section, like and subscribe, and all that shit, yeah.
When someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. Throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. America's jobs and growth are at stake. My fellow Americans, Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan will be visiting me here at the White House next week. It's an important visit because while I expect to take up our relations with our good friend Japan, which overall remain excellent, recent disagreements between our two countries on the issue of trade will also be high on our agenda. As perhaps you've heard, last week I placed new duties on some Japanese products in response to Japan's inability to enforce their trade agreement with us on electronic devices called semiconductors. Now, imposing such tariffs or trade barriers and restrictions of any kind are steps that I am loath to take, and in a moment I'll mention the sound economic reasons for this, that over the long run such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. But the Japanese semiconductors were a special case. We had clear evidence that Japanese companies were engaging in unfair trade practices that violated an agreement between Japan and the United States. We expect our trading partners to live up to their agreements. As I've often said, our commitment to free trade is also a commitment to fair trade. But you know, in imposing these tariffs, we were just trying to deal with a particular problem, not begin a trade war. So next week, I'll be giving Prime Minister Nakasone this same message. We want to continue to work cooperatively on trade problems and want very much to lift these trade restrictions as soon as evidence permits. We want to do this because we feel both Japan and the United States have an obligation to promote the prosperity and economic development that only free trade can bring. Now, that message of free trade is one I conveyed to Canada's leaders a few weeks ago, and it was warmly received there. Indeed, throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. Now, there are sound historical reasons for this. For those of us who lived through the Great Depression, the memory of the suffering it caused is deep and searing. And today, many economic analysts and historians argue that high tariff legislation passed back in that period, called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, greatly deepened the Depression and prevented economic recovery. You see, at first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop competing, and stop making the innovative management and technological changes they need to succeed in world markets. And then, while all this is going on, something even worse occurs. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. The result is more and more tariffs, higher and higher trade barriers, and less competition. So soon, because of the prices made artificially high by tariffs that subsidize inefficiency and poor management, people stop buying. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. The memory of all this occurring back in the 30s made me determined when I came to Washington to spare the American people the protectionist legislation that destroys prosperity. Now, it hasn't always been easy. There are those in the Congress, just as there were back in the 30s, who want to go for the quick political advantage, who risk America's prosperity for the sake of a short-term appeal to some special interest group, who forget that more than 5 million American jobs are directly tied to the foreign export business, and additional millions are tied to imports. Well, I've never forgotten those jobs, and on trade issues, by and large, we've done well. In certain select cases, like the Japanese semiconductors, we've taken steps to stop unfair practices against American products, but we've still maintained our basic long-term commitment to free trade and economic growth. So, with my meeting with Prime Minister Nakasone and the Venice Economic Summit coming up, it's terribly important not to restrict a president's options in such trade dealings with foreign governments. Unfortunately, some in the Congress are trying to do exactly that. I'll keep you informed on this dangerous legislation because it's just another form of protectionism, and I may need your help to stop it. Remember, America's jobs and growth are at stake. Until next week, thanks for listening, and God bless you.